Good evening and welcome to our Parsha class, Sparks, Tidbits of the Parsha. This week we have a double Parsha. It's part of a series of double Parshas that we have in non-leap years because there are more Parshas than there are weeks. Some of the Parshas are consolidated. These two Parshas, Tazria and Metzora, are consolidated because of a very good reason. They both discuss the very same theme, the theme of a specific type of ritual impurity called tsaras, which is incorrectly translated as leprosy. The reason for that mistranslation is obvious because this is a skin disease, and the person who is so afflicted would be quarantined. The only difference is that, number one, the symptoms are not the symptoms of leprosy. It is not a contagious disease, and that's not the reason why the person would be quarantined. This is a physical manifestation of a spiritual disorder. That's how our sages in the Talmud and later on in Hasidic and other mystical writings understand this kind of skin disease. That it was a result of the person who, among other things, but the most prominent of sins is Lashon Hara, or as we say it in the vernacular, Lashon Hara, evil tongue, speaking ill of another. When a person would engage in such talk, the result, the consequence would be that he would break out, or she would break out, with this type of skin disease, referred to, as I said, as tsaras, or just the general term negoim, afflictions, which would go through stages in how it spread, and when it spread, it would require another quarantining besides the original one when it was first detected. And once the person has gone through the periods of quarantining and the lesion, the skin disease, has abated, then the person would go through a purification process. They would have to shave off all their hair, and they would have to bring a special sacrifice. That's one subject. Another subject is if it affects one's clothing, the discoloration of the clothing, that would render the clothing impure. And the third one, which is in the second Parsha, discusses the negoim that afflicted the houses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that aspect later. Now, before we get into the tsaras, the Parsha itself really begins on another note. It begins about the laws concerning a woman in childbirth. And the name of the Parsha, Tazria, is related to the word conception. When a woman conceives and bears a child, she is ritually unclean. If it's a boy, for a week. If it's a girl, it's for 2 weeks. Now, let's try to understand what is the significance and what is the reason for this type of impurity. There's so many misconceptions about the term tumma, which we translate as unclean or impure, because it has connotations as someone who is some way inferior, degraded, but that's certainly not the case. Let me just give a very brief analysis of what the Torah means when it says that someone is tameh, someone is unclean or impure. It's certainly not a physical type of uncleanness or impurity. It's a ritual or spiritual kind. And it is not a suggestion that the person who is tameh is an inferior kind of person. What it means is that the person is in a state of low. Because where is God's energy manifested more than in any other place, besides in the acts of goodness and kindness and mitzvahs that we do, but where in nature is God more evident? Where there is vibrant life. Where there is no life, an inanimate object, although it exists because of God's power, the divine element within that rock, for example, is a very concealed presence. In a plant, God's presence is even stronger. than in a stone, and an animal which can walk around, run around, is mobile. There's a greater expression of the divine source of life, but nowhere is that presence of God more pronounced than in a human life. And when a person does a mitzvah, that's even stronger, of course. But even just by living, there is a manifestation of the divine. That's why, parenthetically, this is a subject for another discussion, Judaism values life so much, because even if life has no quality, which is not a given, but even if it had no quality, life itself has intrinsic value because it represents God's presence in this world. And therefore, when a person dies, we say Kaddish. One of the reasons for that is because there's a vacuum, a divine vacuum, that we have to refill by the Kaddish. At any rate, when a person is alive, that's where God's presence is vibrant. When a person is less alive, for example, when a person sleeps, which is part of life, a necessity, that means that God's presence has been somewhat muted, somewhat curtailed. It's a time to rejuvenate oneself so that the next day when they go forward, they can go with greater intensity, greater impetus, because they experience this lull. Before you run, you crouch as a way of getting up and running faster. And there are many other metaphors and analogies that can be used. So therefore, when a woman gives birth, that is the greatest presence of life. Not just she's alive, but she's producing new life together with her divine partner. And because of that, she, until childbirth, is in the most advanced state of godly expression. As soon as she gives birth, it means that the additional life that she had is no longer part of her. There's a vacuum. And as the Kotzker Rebbe, famous Hasidic master, said, that when there is a vacating of holiness, that's when the forces of impurity set in. They want to grab at least some residual amount of holiness that they could use to nourish themselves. So where there is greater life, and that life is no longer there, there is a greater lull, however we explain it. And the lull is greater when a woman gives birth to a girl than it is for a boy, because since the girl is the source of life, of creating new life, more so than the man, therefore her kedusha, when a woman carries a female, is greater, and therefore when she gives birth and that kedusha is no longer part of her, there's a greater lull and a greater presence of impurity. But impurity here is not a suggestion that the person is inferior. It just means it's part of God's natural cycle, where there is a pause, there is a lull, there is a withdrawal, if you will, that is part of the natural cycle to give us strength to go forward, to embark on even a higher level of growth. Now the Torah in this week's Parsha begins talking about a woman who gives birth. Last week, the Parsha ended with a discussion of kosher and non-kosher animals. Animals that are pure, clean, and animals that are unclean, behema tmeya. So the Midrash tells us, Rashi quotes it, that just like when God created man, it was created after the creation of all the animals, so too when we talk about the laws concerning animals and people, God first talks about the laws concerning animals, and then the laws concerning people. This echoes the words of the Talmud that humans were created last. We're last, but we're also first. If we behave, then we're first. If we don't behave, then we're last. What does that mean? One explanation is, the way it's understood in Chassidus, is that if we don't behave, then we're lower than every other creature. The fact that we were created the last is indicative of our loneliness, because only we as humans have the power to degrade ourselves. An animal does whatever it's programmed to do instinctively. We could degrade ourselves, so we are, by definition, in the potential state, lower than every other creature. But if we do the right thing and we live up to God's expectations of us, and only we humans could elevate the world, then we actually are first. Why? Because in God's thought, when God created the world, the first thing he had in his thought was the Jewish people, the souls of the Jewish people. Yisrael olu b'machshava, the Midrash says. Israel, the Jewish people, arose in God's thought. In the first thought that he had, so to speak, we were already present, because we are the ones for whom God created the world, so that we can fulfill his purpose in making the world a dwelling place for God. So we are the first, but we can also degrade ourselves to become the last. And that's why the Torah talks first about the animal and then about the person, to tell us that we are either inferior to the animal or that we have the power to elevate the entire creation, including the animals. The Torah goes on to say, this is chapter 12, verse 2, B'yom Hashmini, on the 8th day, you should circumcise the foreskin. The actual commandment of circumcision was mentioned in Genesis, in Bereshis, where God tells Abraham to circumcise himself. But here the Torah repeats this commandment to emphasize the importance of circumcision on the 8th day, that it overrides even the Shabbos. The act of circumcision under any other circumstances is forbidden on Shabbos, but if it's the 8th day, you can do it on Shabbos. Circumcision overrides Shabbos. Now, I just want to mention a practical matter, because a lot of people are not aware of this, that you cannot have a bris before the 8th day. If one does have a bris before the 8th day, there's a whole controversy amongst the greatest authorities of Jewish law whether the person is considered circumcised. And to avoid that tragedy, that even after circumcision the person is not considered circumcised, one should never allow for circumcision before the 8th day. Now, in the case of health concerns, you're not allowed to do it on the 8th day. It has to be postponed, and that is determined by the mohel in consultation, of course, with the physician. Actually, Jewish law is even more strict than the doctors when it comes to jaundice, the yellow baby, and that is because, as the Rambam says, you can always circumcise the child, you can never bring back a life. And the Rebbe explains that when you postpone a bris for health reasons, even though it's no longer the 8th day, and you can't do it on Shabbos, but it's considered as if you fulfilled the mitzvah of doing it on time. Now, when we come to a bris and we do the circumcision, there are certain parts that the mohel says, the father, the child says. The baby doesn't say anything, he just cries, of course. And there's also the refrain that we all respond to, and that is Kashem shenichnas labris, ken yikonas l'teira u'lechupa u'lemaisim teva. Just as he entered into the covenant, so shall he enter into Torah, chuppah, marriage, u'masim tovim, and good deeds. Well, what is the point in making this comparison? If you just want to give a blessing, you should just say that this child should be blessed, that he should study Torah, and he should get married, and he should be able to perform good deeds. Why are we comparing it to circumcision? And there are several explanations. I'll share one or two. One is that just as the child who is circumcised will not have any ulterior motives, will not do it to show off, will not do it to gain respect or any type of recognition, the child is completely clueless. That's how, ideally, we should study Torah. That's how we should enter into the advanced stages of our Judaism. Do it with sincerity and not for ulterior motives. Another interpretation is just like the bris is not a one-time act. It's continuous. The Midrash, the Talmud, relates that King David was once taking a shower, bathing, and of course he wasn't dressed, And he thought to himself, "Oy, I am naked more than just in the physical sense. I don't have any mitzvahs. Because in a bathhouse, you can't wear tefillin. You don't even have a mezuzah." So he felt naked in the spiritual sense until he reminded himself that he is circumcised. That is a continuous mitzvah. Well, the same way circumcision is a permanent sign and a continuous mitzvah, that's how we should enter into Torah. That the Torah should not be a fleeting thing, it should be a permanent thing. Same thing with chuppah. Our marriage should not be a short-lived marriage, and likewise our good deeds should be permanent. Another third possibility is, just like we enter into the covenant, when you do a bris, it's not a superficial thing. You enter into it. It consumes you. It's something that overwhelms you because it's such a powerful physical act that changes the configuration of your body and has an effect on your body. The same way we should be affected positively by all the good things that we will be doing in the future, which includes Torah, marriage, and good deeds. Then the Parsha goes on to talk about the laws of Tzaras. It starts off in chapter 13, verse 2. It says, Adam, if a person will have in his flesh, and it goes on to describe different kinds of lesions, which are what Tzaras is all about. And he has to be brought to Aaron or any Kohen who determines whether the person has a real lesion that requires the person to be secluded, the person would be declared unclean, or it's just something that doesn't really have any serious consequences. When the Torah addresses this commandment, it starts off with the word Adam. Adam, of course, is Adam. People are only called Adam when we describe a person of a high level, of a high stature. Otherwise, the Torah will just use the word Ish. Ish means a man, an adult man. There's another way of saying man in Hebrew, Enosh or Gever, but the most common word for man is Ish. Every now and then you can find the word Adam, which represents the higher level human being. Adam comes from a root which means Adama, you can come from the earth, but also Adam el Elyon, I'm like the one above. A human being is created in God's image and reflects the divine. But the question is, if we're talking about impurity over here, someone who is guilty of Lashon Hara, who spoke ill, and that's why they break out in this type of skin disease, why does the Torah describe this person as an Adam? So the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, in his work, Likutei Torah, in his classic work, explains that this type of disease, this type of impurity is actually only applies to people of a very high spiritual stature. That this disease really means that there's a very powerful force that the person is not able to contain and internalize, and it causes the person to break out in this type of skin disease. There's a type of, you could say, just like a person would break out in a rash if they're allergic to something. It's an allergic reaction to too much spiritual energy. So you have to really be at a high spiritual level. And of course, if you're in a high spiritual level, the Lashon Hara that you speak is probably a very subtle form. Of course, where do we find this? Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was asked by God to take the Jews out of Egypt, and Moshe said something that was somewhat critical of the Jewish people. He spoke Lashon Hara about them, and he broke out in Tzaras. Miriam said something disparaging about Moshe, although it was certainly not intended to put him down in a really bad way, but for such a righteous woman, her body was not able to integrate the spiritual energy, and she broke out into this skin disease of Tzaras, and the people had to wait for her for a week. At any rate, this is a disease only for high spiritual level people. To put it in simple terms, if a person of a lower stature does something wrong, they're not allergic to it. They can internalize, they can absorb it. It's part of their personality, unfortunately. But when a person of a high stature, a tzaddik, when they do something that is on their level, inconsistent with their holiness, their body expels it. It can't contain it. It's expelled, and it comes out on the surface. And this explains, the Rebbe says in one of his discourses, why the Talmud refers to Mashiach, the holiest and greatest of all human beings, as a Metzora, as someone afflicted with tsaras. So the Rebbe explains, there are several explanations, but one of them is that just like tsaras means that the person cannot internalize impurity, it's only on the surface, so too, Mashiach lives in a time, the time the Rebbe says we are in right now, where we have already refined ourselves as a people, and we're talking about our collective identity since the beginning of time, that we have already removed all the internal evil, and all the evil that exists, and there's plenty of it, unfortunately, is on the surface. It's like the Metzora. So there's the last tinge of evil that has to still be removed, and that's Mashiach's job, together with our efforts, because we all have a spark of Mashiach in us, to remove that surface, superficial, peripheral impurity. There's an interesting interpretation on the words Adam, person who has this affliction. There are 4 places where the Torah uses the term Adam, and followed by the word ki in some of the places. This is one of them, person who has this tsaras. Another one is later on in the Torah where it talks about Adam Kiyamus, a person who dies, the laws of impurity of coming in contact with the dead. We had before the beginning of Vayikra Adam Kiyakriv, a person who will offer a sacrifice. And then we also have in the Psalms Adam Ubehema Toshia Hashem. Adam, a person, and an animal, God will help, God will save. So one of the commentators says that this corresponds to another medrash, to a medrash that talks about 4 responses about how to deal with someone who sins. Sha'alu l'chachma, they asked wisdom. That means logic. What does common sense say? A person who sins, what should happen? The person has to be punished. That's the accepted norm of society. That's what wisdom says. Well, that corresponds to this week's portion. A person who sinned breaks out in tsaras. That is a form of affliction and suffering. Shalu nevuah, they ask prophecy. Oh, that's a different story. Prophecy means the energy that connects us to God, the pipeline that gives us our life and our sustenance, and you committed a sin. That means that you severed that pipeline. It's like severing the trachea. Well, you can't breathe. So what's the answer? They ask nevuah, and the nevuah says, let the person die. It's a consequence. That's the second verse. Adam kiyamus. Adam, a person who will die. Then shalu the Torah. Then they ask the Torah, what should a person who sins do? The Torah says, let him bring a sacrifice. That's the verse, Adam kiyakra, a person who brings a sacrifice. But then they ask God, who transcends even his Torah, what does a sinner do? God says, let him do tshuva, let him return to me, let him resolve not to do it again. I will help him escape the clutches of his sin. That's the 4th verse, Adam ubehema Toshia Hashem, the Adam, the person, and the animal God saves. Now, one final thing about the Metzora, or maybe 2 final things. Number 1, why is Metzora a punishment for Lashon Hara, for speaking ill of another? Well, the simple answer is, when you speak ill of another, it harms the other. People keep away from them. People feel that that person is a bad person. They don't want to associate. They don't want to socialize with that person. So you cause separation. Well, that's what Saras requires, that the person be separated, quarantined. You get a little bit, a taste of your own medicine. But there's a deeper reason. The word Metzora is an acronym for Motzi Ra, someone who takes out the evil of another. exposing their evil. The Baal Shem Tov explained that when you speak Lashon Hara, what you're doing is much more than just spreading bad things about a person that may even be true, but you're spreading it and you're harming the person, but it's worse than that. Because we all have hidden good and hidden evil. And if we keep our hidden evil, we don't touch it. It's like asbestos. If you don't touch it, it won't harm you. You start poking around and trying to remove it, it's going to contaminate the air, and you can breathe it, and it can be very harmful. When you speak ill of someone, it could be they have that fault, but it's under control, it's under wraps. Speech has the power to reveal and expose and actualize something that is there, that is concealed beneath the surface, that is even only in a state of potentiality. Speech takes your thoughts and reveals it. Lashon Hara, when you speak ill of someone, you have motzi ra, you have expressed the hidden negativity and extracted it, exposed it, and therefore you have harmed the person much more than the person would have been harmed had he just allowed his hidden evil to remain there untouched. Now, what happens to the Metzora? He has to be brought to the Kohen. Why the Kohen? So the Rebbe explains the Kohen is the Ish HaChesed. He's the man of kindness. The only one who could declare someone unclean, impure, afflicted, tainted, is someone who does it with kindness, with love. You can only rebuke someone that you love. Just like it says, the one who God loves, he rebukes. When God rebukes us, he does it with love. We can only rebuke someone and try to set them straight and put them in their place, so to speak, only when we do it because of our concern for that person. If we do it because we hate the person, and we do it because we are just a negative type of person and we look for the negative, that's something that we're not allowed to do. And the Baal Shem Tov said that when we see the negative, and it's interesting, the word nega that the Torah uses here might be related to the word negative. When you are a negative person, you're looking in a mirror. You're seeing a reflection of yourself. Unless, the Rebbe emphasizes, you see the challenge to help the other person. That's the role of a Kohen, to be the man of kindness, not just to compliment everyone, but to see the negative as a way of helping the person get rid of it. Now, one of the signs of this impurity is that this nega, this skin lesion, turns white. And that makes the person tameh. So the question is asked, white is the symbol of purity. In Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would wear white. The prophet Isaiah talks about how our sins, which are red, crimson, turn white as a sign of purity. We dress up in white, in a kittel, a white kittel on Yom Kippur. So why is white a symbol of impurity? The answer is white is neither pure or impure. White means we reveal the inner whiteness, the inner aspect of the person. On Yom Kippur, our pnimius, our innermost spirituality and godly energy comes out into the open. White means bearing who we really are. Well, we really are, deep down, holy people. We have a holy soul. And that's what is revealed in Yom Kippur, and that's expressed by the color white. But when someone speaks Lashon Hara, that person is bearing the soul of another in a negative way. But that's also related to the idea of white. That's why in the Talmud, when it talks about embarrassing someone, it refers to it as halbanas hapanim, whitening the face. Because when a person is embarrassed, they turn red, blood rushes to their face, and then the blood withdraws and they become very pale and white. So the question is, why describe embarrassment by the second phase where the person's blood drains and the person becomes white? Why not describe it as red, reddening the face? And the answer is because the embarrassment, the pain of the embarrassment is not the red, it's the bearing of that person's private life and things that the person does not want exposed. That's what makes the person embarrassed, and that's what destroys the person's dignity, and that's why it's compared to bloodshed. Now, when we talk about Tzaras, there's a story in the book of Kings where Naaman, an Aramean, was afflicted with Tzaras, and he comes to the prophet Elisha to heal him. This is the Haftorah of the Parsha of Tazria. There's Naaman, who was the general of the Arameans, and he comes to Elisha, who he hears is a godly man, a prophet, and he expects him to wave a magic wand or something similar to that, and he would become clean and healed. Instead, Elisha tells him to bathe in the Jordan, and at first he gets very upset. Do I need the Jordan? I don't have rivers where I come from. Anyone could take a bath in a river and think that it's going to heal them. But of course, he eventually did it and he was healed. Why did Elisha, where did he get the idea to tell him to bathe in the Jordan? Obviously, he was a prophet, so he probably got it from on high. But one of the great Kabbalists said it's hinted in this week's Parsha. Naaman, the general, had a name that begins with the letter Nun and ends with the letter Nun. There are 3 verses in the Torah, because everything is hinted in the Torah. So Elisha looks into the Torah and says there are 3 verses that begin and end with a Nun. One of them is in this week's Parsha, where it says, Nega Tzaras, a affliction of Tzaras, and it ends, the word Nega begins with a Nun, and it ends, you bring him to the Kohen, which ends with a Nun. So right away he identified the hint to Naaman in this Parsha, that Naaman is someone afflicted with Tzaras. Now Naaman comes to a Navi, to a prophet. Well, we find another verse in the book of Deuteronomy where it says, Navi mikirbacha, a prophet from amongst you, you shall appoint, and it ends with the words Tishma'un, you shall listen to him. The verse begins with a Nun, Navi, and ends with a Nun, Tishma'un. Well, that again is a hint to the fact that this Naaman is coming to the prophet. Now the question is, what does the prophet tell him? There's a third verse, and that third verse is when the 2 tribes promised they will cross the Jordan to join their brethren and then return, they said, Nachnu, we will go with our brethren, and we will cross Navar Hayarden, the Jordan. So the verse begins with the word Nachnu, a Nun, and ends with the word Hayarden, the Jordan, which ends with a Nun. So Elisha took this as the hint that what should Naaman, who's afflicted with Tzaras, what should the prophet tell him? Go into the Jordan. Okay. Then when it talks about the Kohen, the Torah says that he has to be brought to the Kohen. Then it says the Kohen has to go out to him. So the question is asked, if he comes to the Kohen, why does the Kohen have to go out? Well, one interpretation with a very powerful lesson is that when you help someone, they come to you for help. You have to go out of yourself to go into that person's domain, outside of the camp, of your camp. You're living in a camp, you're insulated. You don't understand that person's plight and that person's situation. You don't know where they're coming from. You can't judge a person until you're in their shoes, as they say. Well, here you can't help a person because you don't understand what they really are in need of and what is ailing them and what are their limits and what are their strengths. You have to go out into their camp, identify with their problem. There's a famous story of the Rebbe Maharash, whose anniversary of his birthday is tonight, Beis Iyar, the 2nd of Iyar. The Rebbe Maharash was not a very well person physically. He passed away at a very young age, at 48. And he would have a very brief period during the day when he would accept visitors whom he would mentor and counsel. And before he would meet with people, his gabbai, his assistant who would help out in the house, he was the attendant, would give him a fresh set of clothing. An hour later, he would have to give him another set of clothing because they were drenched with perspiration. Just 1 hour. So the attendant, who was not that smart, says to the Rebbe, I just brought you a fresh change of clothing an hour ago, and now I have to do it again? What's going on? So the Rebbe explained to him on his level as follows. He says, imagine someone comes to me and wants me to help them. How could I help them? I'm who I am, and they are who they are. We're different worlds. I don't have his problem, so how could I help him? The answer is, I have to take off my clothing, the way I see things, the way I feel, and then I have to put on his clothing. I have to go into his shoes, into his garments, and become him. But I can't help him then, because just like he couldn't help himself, now that I am him, I can't help him. So I have to then take off his clothing and put my own clothing back on again, so I can have the proper, objective, detached perception of what should be done for him to be helped. Well, when I had in 1 hour 20 people, or whatever the number was, that came to see me, I had to get undressed and dressed, and undressed and dressed for each person. Multiply that by 20, you're talking about 80 times getting dressed and undressed. That's why I perspired. What the Rebbe Maharash was saying is that if you really want to help someone, you have to put yourself into their situation totally. Then you withdraw from it so you can have the right perspective and you can help the person. So yes, you bring the person to the Kohen. Only the Kohen can help. He has the perspective. But then the Kohen has to go out into the camp. Now, it also, in the atonement process, you have to bring 2 birds. One bird is slaughtered as a sacrifice. The other bird is sent away. Now, the bird is a symbol of peace. The word tzipor, numerically, gematria, is the same as the word shalom, peace. A bird flies from one country to another. It unites. The Gemara says if you have a dream of a bird, you should anticipate peace. So the idea of bringing this atonement is that Lashon Hara is a manifestation of discord and division. And if it isn't yet divided, it will make the people divided. So you need the bird. That's one symbolism in the bird. Another symbolism is the bird is always singing and chirping. There are people who just talk a lot, and when you talk a lot, you eventually will say something that is not wise and unwarranted. Famous story of the Chafetz Chaim, who was the author of the work, the classic work that deals with the laws of Lashon Hara, who was once on a train, and someone asks him, and he's on his way back home to his hometown, someone asks him if he knows the Chafetz Chaim. He heard he's such a great tzaddik, such a righteous man. And the Chafetz Chaim, in his humility, says, I know him. It's grossly exaggerated. And the man got so upset that he actually slapped the rabbi in his face. Later on, when the man discovered that the man he slapped was the Chafetz Chaim, he, of course, apologized profusely, and the Chafetz Chaim said, I deserved it, because I talk too much. Just like you shouldn't speak ill of others, you shouldn't speak ill of yourself either, when it's unwarranted. Talk too much, you'll say something very likely that you'll regret. So that's the bird who's always chirping and always singing. But why 2 birds? So one of the explanations is that there are 2 processes here. One process is to send away the bird, the talking. Get rid of your negative fashion of speech. If you feel you want to say something negative, send it away. You're always going to be better off. You'll never regret sending it away. So a person can say, well, I'll be silent. Silence is gold. It says so in the Ethics of the Fathers. There's nothing better than silence. No, that's not what it was intended to convey. Yes, some types of silence is good. Send it away. Send away the speech. But the other bird has to be the korban, has to be brought close to God. Use your power of speech for prayer, for study of Torah, for saying positive things about other people. And this is one of the important lessons of the whole thing of tzaras. Just like speaking ill of others reveals some of their latent evil and negativity and harms them because of that, similarly, when you speak well of people, you say the good things about them, even if it's not overtly true and manifest, the speech itself, positive speech, helps them to reveal their own positive resources. So the lesson is not just not to speak ill, but to find ways of saying positive things about others. The end of the Parsha, closer to the end, it talks about how houses develop lesions, and ultimately the house might have to be destroyed, demolished. So we have two explanations why that is so. One explanation is that when the Amorites, one of the 7 Canaanite tribes, realized the Jews are coming, they hid their treasures in the walls of their homes. So by having these lesions and requiring demolition of the homes, the Jews would find the treasures. Another explanation given in the Zohar seems to be the very opposite. The Amorites were idol worshippers, and their homes were dedicated to idol worship. So God wanted that these homes should be destroyed, the Jews could build new homes. Well, these seem to be two diametrically opposite reasons. The first reason is there were treasures. The second reason is to get rid of the horrible, impure, idolatrous homes. And the answer is they complement each other. When you get rid of the idolatry, when you get rid of the attitudes that there's something else but God, you will discover hidden treasures. That's when all of Golus, all of our exile, is like a home that is afflicted with tzaras. All of exile is considered to be of a very high energy, just like we said before, that a very spiritual person has high energy but can't contain it, so they break out on the surface, on their skin. The same way, Golus, exile, is very high energy, which cannot be internalized because of our limits, and it manifests itself on the surface. When Mashiach takes us out of exile, what will happen then is that then we will be able to internalize this high-level energy, and we will discover the treasures that are buried in the walls of exile that will crumble so that we can take those treasures that couldn't have been assimilated and absorbed by us, and we will take it with us into the age of redemption. Have a good week, and we'll see you, God willing, next week at the same time. Have a happy Beis Ear.